Good evening. It's good to have you with us during these very unusual times. I guess that's an understatement. I am recording from the Thornwell campus. In fact, if you look behind me, you'll see the Thornwell symbol, and certainly appreciate Thornwell's hospitality and their willingness to work with us on this. Of course, the St. Simon's event, where we would typically be, is an event for smaller membership churches. And to make sure that we're all on the same page, I want to give you some descriptions of smaller membership churches, just to sort of get our mind and our heart on the same page, so to speak. So listen to these descriptions of the smaller church, and hopefully you can relate to some of them. Your first visitor in 2 months comes on the Sunday 3 families are gone, and you're preaching on tithing. Your attendance matches the temperature in January in New York. Anything that breathes is counted in Sunday attendance. Or another possibility, your spouse is ill and attendance dips 20%. You need to speak to the clerk of session, the Sunday school superintendent, and treasurer, but he's gone this week. Does any of that resonate with you? Well, this is the world of the smaller membership church. And again, greetings. We're delighted to have you. I'm going to read a passage of Scripture, a short passage, and then I'm going to ask 5 questions of the text. And so get into the text, and then as I ask the questions, I want you to sort of see what the implications will be for you and your particular context. Familiar passage, Luke chapter 5, beginning with verse 4. This is, of course, Jesus is on the side of the lake. He's been in ministry. He's been teaching. And then he has his conversation with Peter. Luke 5, beginning with verse 4. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. God's Word for God's people. Now again, what I would like to do is to present to you 5 questions dealing with this text. And as I ask the questions, I'll of course be responding to the questions, but I want you to as well. I want you to ask yourself, what does this mean for me? What are the implications for my particular context, and so on. The first question is this: are we listening? Are we listening? If Peter hadn't been listening, there'd be no story. It'd be the end of the chapter, so to speak. It'd be all over. But Jesus is the initiator, and that's an important point to remember. He's always the initiator, and he initiates his conversation with Peter. That's where it starts. The listening is critical. You'll remember in Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3, Jesus is addressing the 7 churches of Asia Minor. He addresses each one. And at the conclusion of each of his addresses, he says to them, "He that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches." So listening is vital. Listening is critical. It's where it starts. And I think we need to understand, in listening to God and recognizing His voice among all the other voices out there, take some discipline. It takes some practice, shall we say. I remember the story of a Native American who was invited out to New York to visit one of his friends. And so this Indian man and his friend in New York are walking down a very busy, crowded sidewalk. And the highway is busy too, cars screeching, speeding, honking, and people bumping each other on the sidewalk. And they're walking down this busy sidewalk, and suddenly the Native American stops. And he says, "Do you hear that?" And his friend in New York says, "Hear what?" And the Native American says, "The cricket. Do you hear the cricket?" And the New York fellow stops and says, "Are you crazy? How can you hear a cricket with all of this noise and commotion going on?" And the Indian says, "Just wait a minute." And they stop. And he walks over to a flower pot that was right on the side of the walkway, this sidewalk there. He reaches into the flower pot and pulls out a cricket. And his New York friend says, "How in the world did you do that?" And without saying a word, the Native American reaches into his pocket and gets out a whole fistful of coins. And then he drops it on the sidewalk. As soon as those coins hit the sidewalk, everybody on the sidewalk freezes. They heard money. They recognized that sound, and they froze. And so the Native American says to his New York friend, "You know, it's a matter of what you've trained your ears to hear." And there is an urgent need for us in the church to recognize the voice of God. Now, we'll go on and say this. When we talk about listening, are we listening? There's frankly two dimensions, just like there's two great commands: love God, love our neighbor. So in listening, we want to hear the call of God, but we also want to hear the cry of the world, because that's where He has placed us to do ministry. So the first question is, are we listening? Second question, are we willing to serve from a posture of weakness? Are we willing to serve from a posture of weakness? Now again, back to the Peter Jesus story. Now think about Peter. He's a professional fisherman. He's been out on the lake all night doing the best he knows how. He knows where the fish hang out. He knows that lake. He's been out there. He knows what to do. He gave it his best all night. Not even a minnow. Didn't catch a thing. And the question is, even when we feel discouraged, even when we are weary, even when we feel like we've already given our best, are we willing to keep on ministering? Are we willing to step out again? Are we willing to take another initiative? So the question is, are we willing to serve from a posture of weakness? I remember being at a conference. This was in Louisville, Kentucky, and there were mission pastors from all over the country there. And one of the presenters was a church leader from Africa. And he made a very startling, disturbing observation. He said, "You know, you Americans only know how to serve from a posture of strength and power." Ooh, that was painful. That was painful. We only know how to serve from a posture of strength and of power. In other words, when we have the resources, when we have enough people, when we have enough leaders, when we have a plate, all that kind of thing. But are we willing to serve when we feel like we have so few resources, so few finances, so few leaders? Are we willing to go on and serve anyway? I want you to hear this story from Johnny Erickson Tata. Many of you know that name. When she was a teenager, she jumped in a lake and broke her neck and paralyzed neck down. But boy, has God used her, written a lot of books, conference speaker, traveled the world, and so on. Listen to this story. This is Johnny Erickson Tata. Honesty is always the best policy, especially when you're surrounded by women in a restroom during a break at a Christian women's conference. One woman, putting on lipstick, said, "Oh, Johnny, you always look so together, so happy in your wheelchair. I wish that I had your joy." Several women around her nodded. "How do you do it?" she asked as she capped her lipstick. "I don't do it," I said. "May I tell you honestly how I woke up this morning? This is an average day. After my husband Ken leaves for work at 6 a.m., I'm alone until I hear the front door open at 7 a.m. That's when a friend arrives to get me up. While she makes coffee, I pray, Lord, my friend will soon give me a bath, get me dressed, sit me up in my chair, brush my hair and teeth, and send me out the door. I don't have the strength to face this routine one more time. I have no resources. I don't have a smile to take into the day, but you do. May I have yours? God, I need you desperately." "So what happens when your friend comes into the bedroom?" one of them asked. I turn my head toward her and give her a smile straight from heaven. It's not mine, it's God's. I point to my paralyzed legs. Whatever joy you see today was hard won this morning. And then Johnny says this, "I have learned that the weaker we are, the more we need to lean on God. And the more we lean on God, the stronger we find Him to be." Are we willing to serve from a posture of weakness? I can remember I was on a lawnmower, riding more on the church grounds, doing some work. And as I was mowing, I looked down toward the church cemetery and I noticed somebody pulled up and walked through the gate and went down and sat on the ground next to a freshly dug cemetery plot. And I thought, this must be somebody related to the person who was just recently buried there, and I need to go say greetings. So I turned off the mower and I walked down there. At the time I was in my 60s, I was dirty, sweaty. I come up to this woman who must have been in her late 20s. A lot of body piercing, a lot of tattoos all over her. We were quite a contrast, quite different. And she is sitting on the ground next to this freshly dug grave. Her 8-year-old son had died tragically in an accident as he was playing. And so she was just broken and distraught. And I'm wondering, what do I say? What do I do? And as I'm walking up to her, I asked her, "Was this your son?" And she nodded. I said, "Right behind you is another gravestone. That's my son. He died when he was 2 months old." And by that time, I'm choked up. And I asked her, "May I just pray for the two of us?" And so it was a prayer of weeping and searching for words. But we bonded. And it wasn't because I had it all together. It wasn't because I had some wise word to share. It was because we were both broken. Sometimes our most effective ministry occurs out of our weakness, out of our brokenness. We had a church member, officer named Ann Felton, and Ann had a yearning over a community, an impoverished community, frankly. It was in a textile mill community. The mills had all shut down. And so it was cheap rental housing is what it was. And there were a lot of needs in the community. Anne so identified with that community and so longed to serve that community that she relocated. She moved into the community and became part of it that she might serve more effectively. And I think in a very profound way, she was serving effectively because she served out of a posture of weakness. Are we willing to serve out of a posture of weakness? Third question. What has God already placed in our hands? What has God already placed in our hands? Peter, it was a boat and nets. Moses, it was a staff. David, it was his sling. And God used all of that. Ordinary things, common things that they used and were accustomed to every day. But God used it in a special way. What we need to be willing to do is to look at our congregation's resources through God's eyes. What has God already placed in our hands that He might use for His benefit? You know, think of your facilities. Could we use it for a scout group? Could we use it for an AA group? Think about where you're located, the site of your church facilities. What are you near? I can remember a number of years ago, we were on a prayer journey. We were going expedition, I guess you could call it. We had a caravan. We went from church site to church site to pray, you know, to hear the story of the congregation. And we went to this very remote church site way out in the boonies. I mean, the only way you can find it is to have a personal guide. And the members were few and elderly. But when we pulled up there, all the young people that were in this expedition went crazy. Whoa, what a neat place. Wow, what a great place to have scouts and all that kind of thing. You know, sometimes we need other people to help us see maybe what we don't see. What kind of connections do the church members have with other people or other agencies or other institutions, other churches? What are the gifts and abilities that we have? What has God already placed in our hands? Let me give you some examples of how God has marvelously used sometimes simple, meager resources. Nellie Dean is deceased, but she's given me permission before she passed away to use stories about her. Nellie grew up in poverty. Her parents did not treat her very well. And she got married when she was probably about 19 or 20. She soon became pregnant. When the baby was born, her husband walked out on her. So here she is, single mother with an infant child. She goes to work in the mill, and it wasn't easy. When I got to know Nellie, she was already in retirement on a very low, modest, fixed income. And it was beautiful how she responded to the Lord and so on. But anyway, she's worshiping with us one Sunday, and she heard me say, this was a few years ago, that $3.14 would feed a student down in Haiti for 1 month. After the service, Nellie Dean comes up and says, Herb, I know what it is to be hungry. I don't want a little boy or a little girl down in Haiti to go hungry. So she gave me 3 wrinkled $1 bills. And she says, I'll bring you the 14 cents next week. Well, some people overheard that conversation. Word started going out about what Nellie Dean, on a very modest fixed income, was willing to do, give the $3 she had. And before the week was out, $1,000 came in for the hungry of Haiti. So rather than feeding one, Miss Nellie Dean ended up feeding over 300. Another story, there's a little church down in the southern part of Georgia. And one day, some of the members were standing around, most of whom were women. And they were standing around conversing, and they said, what can we do? What do we have? What can we do? And one lady said, we can sew, And you know, that's what they started doing. They started sewing. They bought special fabric and they started sewing garments for preemies, premature babies. And they would put together these little packages with little blankets and garments, and then they would have cards of prayer and biblical statements and so on. And they gave those packages to the local hospital. So anytime a preemie was born, they would be ready with special garments made out of, special cloth. Well, as they did that, it became very popular, and they realized, some of the preemies do not survive. Some babies die at birth. And so they realized we need to make these packages available to our local funeral homes. So that's what they did. They started sewing and putting together these special garments for babies that didn't survive. And of course, they would include prayers, and they would include biblical passages and so on. And it was very popular. What a beautiful, beautiful, powerful ministry. Give you another example. For the past 25 years, churches and members of churches in Lawrence County, South Carolina, have been going down to Haiti. Been going down for quite a while, 25 years now. Well, about 10 years ago, you heard the awful, terrible, catastrophic news of the earthquake that hit Haiti. Many, many people perished. Many were maimed. We go down and work with a number of schools scattered around across the island. One of our schools was totally destroyed. There was a young lady at Thornwell, right here, 13 years old, and she heard about that. And she said, I don't need my weekend allowance or spending money, whatever it was. I wanted to go to rebuilding that school. Well, word got out of this young lady's commitment, 13 years old, to give her a few dollars towards the newspapers picked it up. And pretty soon, through Thornwell, $10,000 had come to rebuild the school. Well, other people heard about it. A church right on the Harvard campus up in New England heard about it, sent us $3,000. A church in Spain heard about it, sent us $2,800. Some folks in California heard about it, sent us money. Pretty soon we had $26,000, and that school was rebuilt because of what that little 13-year-old girl did with what she had in her hand. What is it? The question that we need to ask ourselves. What has God already placed in our hands? How does God see that resource? How do we see it through missional eyes? Question 4. Are we willing to go where Jesus says to go? Think about it. Are we willing to go where the Lord sends us? Are we willing to go where the Lord of the harvest tells us to go? Now think about Peter. He had been fishing all night, didn't catch a thing. And what does Jesus tell him to do? Go right back to where he came from. And we don't have in the scripture what he was thinking, what he might have been mumbling under his breath. But I can imagine Peter just shaking his head saying, man, this doesn't look good. I've been doing that all night long and didn't come up with anything. But he obeys and goes right back to where Jesus tells him to go. For about 30 or 40 years, the church was dramatically impacted with what we would call the church growth movement. There was a great emphasis on, how can we grow churches? And so the emphasis was on attraction. How can we get people to come to our congregation, our worship center, our Sunday school classes? How can we fill up our parking lot? In the past couple decades, there's been a shift in the focus, and it's what we might call the deployment model. How many in our congregation are we equipping, empowering, motivating, inspiring to go out, to go out into the community to serve, to go out into the community and bear witness. How many are going out? You remember this quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. This comes from his book that he wrote while he was in prison, Letters and Papers from Prison. He says, "The church is the church only when it exists for others." The church is the church only when it exists for others. And so, what we need to be willing to do, I think, is to look at our community through a fresh perspective. Look at our community through missional eyes. Is there a community near us of individuals that are retired or disabled on fixed income? Could we serve them? Are they underserved? Is there a prison nearby? Could we connect to the families of inmates? Do we know single parents who are trying to earn a living and raise their children, something almost impossible to do? Are there ways we can step forward? Are there institutions nearby that we could network with and collaborate with in doing ministry? Are we willing to go where Jesus says to go? One of the statements that Jesus makes that's so haunting, he says, "The harvest is plentiful." The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Are we willing to go where Jesus says go? Final question. Are we willing to work with others? Are we willing to collaborate, cooperate, communicate with others to do ministry? Are we willing to work with others? Peter, remember, obeys Jesus. He goes out, throws out the net, probably not expecting a whole lot. But boy, was he shocked. He discovered that the harvest indeed is plentiful. And he had to get others to come and assist him. There were so many fish being brought in through the nets that he had to get assistance. And I think, we need to remember that. We need to remember that. If we cooperate with others, if we collaborate with others, we will discover that we will be able to do things in mission and ministry that we never dreamed was possible. In Lawrence County, South Carolina, we formed what we call a cluster of small churches. And over the years, these churches, each of the churches that has participated, have ended up doing things that they never were able to going solo, going alone. A vibrant food bank that, my goodness, increased ministry by tenfold during the pandemic. Service camps of young people, hosting international students from all over the place, going down and holding seminars and conferences in places like Haiti and the Dominican Republic, going down to Cuba and visiting and coming alongside churches. All those kind of things were made possible because churches were willing to collaborate. You see, together we can do things we can't do alone. Are we willing to serve with others? Are we willing to collaborate with other congregations, other agencies, institutions, and so on? When we begin to do that, and we engage the community more and more effectively, we develop a testimony. We develop a reputation. People know. They hear about us. They know what we're doing. I want to close by reading to you something that an African American pastor said to a group of college students. Consider what he says. "Children," he said, "you're going to die. One of these days, they're going to take you out to the cemetery, drop you in a hole, throw some dirt on your face, and go back to the church and eat potato salad. When you were born, he said, you alone were crying, and everybody else was happy. The important question I want to ask is this: when you die, are you alone going to be happy, leaving everybody else crying? The answer depends on whether you live to get titles or you live to get testimonies. When they lay you in the grave, are people going to stand around reciting the fancy titles you earned, or are they going to stand around giving testimonies of the good things you did for them? Will you leave behind just a newspaper column telling people how important you were, or will you leave crying people who give testimonies of how they've lost the best friend they ever had? There's nothing wrong with titles. Titles are good things to have. But if it ever comes down to a choice between a title or a testimony, go for the testimony. And so in summary, let me just remind you, are you listening? Are you willing to serve from a posture of weakness? What has God already placed in your hands? Are you willing to go where Jesus says to go? Are we willing to serve with others? In other words, are we ready to fish? Are we ready to fish? God bless you, and may God, the Lord of the harvest, use you abundantly.